My daughter played the wrong song at Sunday dinner and I almost didn't catch it. I was carving the roast, half listening to my son-in-law tell a story about his commute, and the Bluetooth speaker on the counter switched from whatever playlist she had going to a Patsy Cline song, Walkin' After Midnight. I heard the first 3 bars and I went still with the carving knife in my hand. She didn't look at me. That's how I knew. My daughter Hannah is a terrible actress. If she'd been playing that song by accident, she would have laughed and said something about her shuffle being weird. She would have looked right at me and rolled her eyes. Instead, she kept slicing the cucumber she was working on and said, "Dad, you want ice in your water?" Her voice was steady, too steady. I said, "Sure, honey," and I went back to carving the roast like nothing had happened. I want to tell you something before I go any further. I spent 28 years as a claims investigator for a regional insurance carrier out of Hartford. I retired 3 years ago at 61. My specialty was suspicious losses, the kind where a barn burns down 2 weeks after the policy doubles, or a man drowns in 4 feet of water with a policy his wife took out 6 months earlier. I've sat across from a lot of people who were lying to me. I learned how to listen for the things they weren't saying. I learned that the most dangerous people in a room are almost never the ones you'd pick out of a lineup. They're the ones who look exactly like everyone else and laugh at the right jokes. I tell you this because I want you to understand, I should have caught it sooner. I almost didn't catch it at all. Patsy Cline was our code. My wife Margaret died of pancreatic cancer when Hannah was 15. The year after, Hannah went through a stretch where she'd go to friends' houses for sleepovers and call me crying at midnight, asking me to come get her, because she'd panic in unfamiliar places without her mother. I didn't want her to feel ashamed about it in front of her friends, so we made up a thing. If she needed me to come, she'd put on Walkin' After Midnight, Margaret's favorite song, the one we played at the funeral, and she'd say something completely normal about the weather. Anything about the weather. That was the signal. I'd show up 15 minutes later and pretend I was just dropping off her allergy medication or some other lie we'd cooked up. No one ever knew, not even her best friends. It was ours. She used it maybe a dozen times the year she was 16. By 17, she didn't need it anymore. By 18, she was at the University of Connecticut, studying biology, and the song was just a thing we'd had, the way families have 100 small things nobody else knows about. I hadn't thought about that code in over 23 years. Hannah was 38 years old. She had a husband named Doug and 2 kids of her own. She lived in a town called Wethersfield, about 20 minutes from me. We had dinner at her house every other Sunday and at my house the Sundays in between. That night was at her house. Doug was at the table. My grandson Cameron, who is 6, was kicking the leg of his chair and asking when we were going to eat. My granddaughter Madeline, 4 years old, was drawing on a paper placemat with a green crayon. And Hannah, my daughter who never used that song casually, who hadn't played it in front of me in 2 decades, had put it on the speaker and waited to see if I'd hear it. I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher. I waited to see what she'd say. "Supposed to rain Tuesday," she said. "All day, they're saying." There it was. The weather. I want to be careful about what I tell you next, because I want you to feel what I felt at that kitchen table. I had a wedge of roast beef on the end of a serving fork. My son-in-law Doug was sitting 4 feet from me, smiling, refilling his wine glass. My grandkids were right there, and my daughter had just told me that something was wrong and she couldn't say what, and the person she didn't want hearing it was almost certainly somebody in that room or somebody we were about to talk about. I said, "Yeah, I heard that. I was going to mow the lawn Monday, so I beat the rain." She looked at me then, just for a second. Her eyes were wet. Then she turned back to the cucumber and said, "Smart." The rest of that dinner is a blur. I remember Doug talking about a guy at his office who just bought a boat. I remember Cameron knocking over his milk and Madeline laughing and Hannah getting up to grab paper towels. I remember the Patsy Cline song ending and a Willie Nelson song coming on and the speaker doing its work like nothing had happened. I ate. I made jokes. I asked Doug about his job at the engineering firm. I kissed the grandkids on the head, and I left at 8:30 like I always do. I drove home and I sat in my truck in my driveway for 20 minutes with the engine off, trying to figure out what I had just learned. Here's what I knew. Hannah was scared. Hannah did not want to talk in front of Doug, or in front of someone who was going to find out from Doug. Whatever was going on, she'd been sitting with it long enough to remember a code from 23 years ago and decide it was her best option for telling me. I went inside. I made coffee even though it was almost 9. I sat at my own kitchen table, and I made myself think clearly about Doug. I have liked Doug for the 11 years he's been married to my daughter. He's a structural engineer. He drinks 1 beer at family dinners and never more. He coaches Cameron's t-ball team. He calls me sir even though I've asked him not to. When my truck transmission went out 2 summers ago, he drove 40 minutes to pick me up at the dealership at 10 o'clock at night without complaint. I have never seen him raise his voice at Hannah or at the kids. I do not believe Doug is a man who would do something to my daughter, but I have been wrong about people before, and the first rule of investigation is that you don't decide what the answer is before you gather the facts. So I sat with my coffee, and I went through what I actually knew. Hannah had been quieter than usual for about 6 weeks. Margaret used to say Hannah goes inward when she's worried. I'd noticed it, but I'd written it off to the new job. She'd left a position at a regional bank in February to take a job as a controller at a logistics company about 30 minutes north of her house. She'd been telling me for 2 months that the new job was a lot. Long hours, new systems, a boss she described as intense but okay. I hadn't pushed. She was 38 years old, and I'd learned a long time ago that my job as her father was mostly to listen, not to solve. But now I was thinking about that job differently. I was thinking about a daughter who'd come home from her first month at a new position and started losing weight. About a Sunday in May when she'd come over to my house alone, no Doug, no kids, and sat on my back porch for an hour and barely said anything. About the fact that the last 3 times I'd seen her, she'd looked at her phone with something I can only describe as flinch. I picked up my own phone. I texted her, got home safe, lawnmower's ready for Monday. It took her 46 minutes to respond. The text said, glad, hey, can you come for coffee Tuesday morning? Doug has a site visit out of town. Kids will be at school. I wrote back, of course. What time? She wrote, 9. I wrote, I'll be there. I didn't sleep much that night. I'd had practice with cases where I had to wait for the next piece of information before I could do anything, but waiting for something connected to your own daughter is different. It's a particular kind of slow-burning awful. I thought about driving to her house at midnight and asking her flat out. I knew I couldn't. Whatever this was, she'd chosen her moment. I had to trust that. Tuesday morning, I left my house at 8:15 for a 20-minute drive. I sat in a Dunkin' parking lot down the road from her house for 15 minutes because I didn't want to be early. At 9 on the dot, I pulled into her driveway. She opened the door in sweats and her hair in a knot, and her eyes red the way they used to get when she was 16 and had been crying in her room without telling me. She didn't say anything, she just stepped aside and let me in. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table from Sunday, and she pushed a mug of coffee across to me and said, Dad, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it like that. You did it exactly right, I said. Tell me. It came out in pieces over the next hour. I'm going to give it to you the way I put it together, not the way she told me it, because she went in and out of it and circled back and apologized about 6 times and at one point couldn't talk for 2 full minutes. The way she told it was the way a person who has been carrying something alone for months finally lets it out. The way I'm going to tell it is the way an investigator hears it. About 4 months ago, shortly after she'd started the new job, a man started showing up at the gym she went to in the mornings before work. He was in his late 40s, fit, well-dressed, drove a black Audi. His name was Trevor Halsworth, or so he said. He started at the treadmill next to hers one morning and made small talk about the weather. 2 mornings later, he was there again. By the 3rd week, he was striking up real conversations. Hannah is a friendly person. She talked to him. He told her he was a wealth management consultant who just relocated from Boston. He told her he'd been recommended to the area by a mutual friend whose name didn't quite check out when Hannah mentioned it to me later. He started timing his workouts to match hers. Within a month, he was buying her coffee at the cafe attached to the gym after their workouts. He was extremely careful, she said, to never make it feel romantic. He talked about his ex-wife. He talked about his ex-wife. He talked about his teenage son. He asked about her family. He asked about her husband, casually, the way you'd ask anyone. He asked about her father. I want to stop here for a second. When she told me he'd asked about her father, my stomach turned over the way it does when you realize something you should have realized hours ago. Because I had heard about Trevor Holsworth. Hannah had mentioned him to me 3 weeks before Sunday dinner. Just in passing. She'd said there was a guy at her gym who was a financial guy, and he'd mentioned he was good with retirement portfolios for people her dad's age, and would I be interested in meeting him sometime? I'd said no, I had my retirement set, I wasn't looking. I'd thought nothing of it. She'd dropped it. I was sitting at her kitchen table now realizing that I had been targeted by a man whose name I had already heard, in a conversation I had already forgotten, and that the only reason I wasn't on his list of victims was that I'd been too lazy to take a meeting. But Hannah was. Hannah was on his list. 5 weeks ago, Trevor had asked Hannah if she'd be willing to look at some materials he'd put together for a private investment vehicle he was offering to a small group of select clients. He framed it as her doing him a favor. She was a controller. She had financial training. He wanted a sharp set of eyes on his materials before he formally pitched to the group. She said sure. He emailed her a prospectus. Hannah is good at her job. She read it carefully. The fund described in the materials looked, on the surface, like a legitimate alternative investment vehicle. Real estate development in 3 secondary markets. Tax advantages structured around a particular IRS provision. Returns described as steady rather than spectacular. The kind of thing that wouldn't immediately ping a person who didn't know what they were looking at. But Hannah is, like me, the kind of person whose mind doesn't let things go. She'd noticed 3 small things. The LLC structure had a layer that didn't make sense. The CPA listed as a reference on the document had a license number she couldn't verify in the state directory. And the fund's track record cited 2 prior closings that, when she searched, didn't appear in any of the SEC databases she had access to through her work credentials. She'd mentioned this to Trevor in their next coffee meeting, gently. Just questions. She said something like, I couldn't find the prior closings, am I looking in the wrong place? He smiled at her, she said, and the smile was different than the ones before. He said the prior closings had been private placements and wouldn't appear in public databases. He said the CPA had recently moved his license to a different state. He said he appreciated her thoroughness and that he could tell she'd be a great help in identifying other people in her network who might benefit from the opportunity. That was the first thing that scared her, she said. The phrase, in her network. She hadn't talked about her network. She hadn't said anything about who she knew. The second thing was 4 days later when he texted her a photo. It was a picture of her standing in her own front yard, taken from across the street, getting Madeline out of her car seat. The text underneath said, she's beautiful. Got your dad's eyes, I bet. She'd stared at the phone, she said, for a long time. She'd taken a screenshot. She hadn't responded. He texted again an hour later. Sorry, that came out weird. Saw your post about her birthday last weekend and recognized the house. Was driving by for an appointment. Didn't mean to spook you. There was no post. Hannah's social media is private and she hadn't posted about Madeline's birthday on it anyway. She'd had a small party at home. No public anything. She told Doug that night. Doug got angry, not at her, she made me understand, but in the helpless way men get angry when they realize someone has been watching their family. He wanted to call the police. Hannah talked him out of it. She thought, in that moment, that if she just stopped responding to Trevor, he'd move on. She stopped going to the gym. She blocked his number. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. She let herself believe it was over. Then, 3 weeks before Sunday dinner, which would be around the time she'd casually mentioned him to me, she got a LinkedIn message from a man named Trevor Holsworth, who was now connected to 4 people in her company, including her boss. The message was professional, friendly. Said he'd run into her at the gym and hoped she was well. Said he was thinking about her father and wanted to know if there was a good time to reach out to him directly. He understood she hadn't gotten back to him about the investment materials, and that was fine. But he wanted to make sure he could connect with her father about a different opportunity that might be a fit for someone in retirement. She didn't respond to the LinkedIn message either, but she understood now what she was dealing with. He was telling her he could get to her father without her. He was telling her he knew where she lived, where her child was, where she worked. He was making sure she understood not to make trouble for him. That was when she started watching Doug. Not because she thought Doug had anything to do with it. She didn't, and I don't either. but because she was afraid Doug would react in a way that would make things worse. She was afraid Doug would call the police or confront Trevor or show up at the gym, and that whatever Trevor was, he would find a way to make her family pay for it. She told me she'd been managing Doug, managing me, managing her own face at the dinner table for 3 weeks. She didn't know who to call. She was afraid that if she called the cops with what she had, they wouldn't have enough. She was afraid that Trevor would find out she'd called and that the photo of Madeline would not be the last photo. I asked her one question. "Sweetheart, do you still have the screenshots?" She nodded. "All of them? The texts, the LinkedIn message, the email with the prospectus?" She nodded. "You did everything right," I told her. "You did everything right, and I am going to handle this. I want to tell you what I did next, and I want to tell you in a way that does not make it sound like I'm a hero. I am not a hero. I made one phone call to a person I should have thought of 40 minutes earlier, and from that point forward, almost every important decision was made by someone else. That is how this kind of thing is supposed to work. The reason I'm telling you that is because I do not want any father who is listening to this to think that the right move is to go find a man like Trevor Halsworth yourself. That is not the right move. The right move is the boring one." The phone call I made was to a former colleague of mine named Joel. Joel had retired from the same insurance company 2 years before I did, and had then gone to work as an investigator for the state insurance department, which has a fraud unit that works hand in hand with the state attorney general's office on cases like this. Joel and I had worked maybe 15 cases together over the years. He picked up on the third ring and said, "Now this is a surprise. You finally bored enough of retirement to come back?" I said, "Joel, I need a favor and I need it to not be a favor, and I need it to not be a favor." He went quiet. He said, "Tell me." I told him. I told him about Trevor, about the prospectus, about the photo of Madeline, about the LinkedIn message, about my daughter who had used a code with me that she had not used since she was 16 years old. Joel said, "Don't do anything. Don't tell anyone else. Do not contact him. I will call you back in 3 hours. He called me back in 2. He said, "I made some calls. Your guy is on a list. Different name in Rhode Island, different name in upstate New York. He's run a version of this in 3 states that we know of. The unit's been trying to put together a clean case for 14 months. What your daughter has, the texts, the photo, the prospectus with the falsified CPA, combined with what they already have, is enough to move. They want to meet with her tomorrow morning. They'll come to her house. No uniforms. Will she do it?" I called Hannah. I told her what Joel had said. She cried for the first time since I'd gotten there that morning, which I understood. Because the worst part of carrying something alone is not the weight, it's the not knowing if anyone else will ever help carry it. She said yes. She said of course. The next morning, 2 investigators met her and Doug at their kitchen table. They were patient and they were thorough, and they made it very clear to her that none of this was her fault, and that the operation Trevor Halsworth was running depended on people like her staying quiet, and that she had broken that for them, and that everything she'd kept, every screenshot, every email, every voicemail, was going to be used. What happened next took 3 more weeks. I'm not going to walk you through all of it because most of it wasn't done by me. They had Hannah with their guidance send Trevor one more message saying she'd reconsidered the investment materials and was open to talking. He responded within an hour. He suggested a coffee. They had her say she'd prefer to meet at her house when her husband was at work. He liked that. He said yes. He arrived on a Thursday at 10 in the morning. Hannah opened the door and walked him to her kitchen table, and she'd made coffee, and she did everything they'd told her to do, which was to be friendly and to ask questions and to let him pitch. He pitched her for 38 minutes. He was, by all accounts, smooth. He answered the questions she'd been told to ask. He produced a new version of the prospectus, this one with paperwork for her to sign, and a wire transfer authorization for $250,000. She told him she'd need to talk to her husband. He told her he understood, but the enrollment window closed Friday. She said she'd let him know by Thursday evening. He left at 10:46. He was arrested at a Comfort Inn outside of Manchester at 2 o'clock that afternoon. The investigation later turned up 3 other women he had approached in the same way over the last 8 months, in Connecticut alone. He had not yet succeeded in extracting money from any of them. 2 of them had introduced him to their parents. One of those parents, a retired widow in Glastonbury, had been hours away from wiring him $140,000 when he was picked up. He is, as I'm telling you this, sitting in a jail cell awaiting trial on charges in 3 states. The case against him in Connecticut alone runs to 31 counts, and the photograph of my granddaughter, a photograph he took from across the street of a 4-year-old child being lifted out of a car seat, is part of the evidence. I want to tell you about one more thing, and then I'll stop. 2 Sundays after the arrest, Hannah and Doug and the kids came over to my house for dinner. I'd made spaghetti, which is the only thing I really know how to make, well, and Margaret's recipe for the sauce, which Hannah taught me how to do 5 years after her mother died, and which, I will be honest, is the only thing I cook that ever tastes like anything. We ate. The kids fought over who got the last piece of garlic bread. Cameron told a long story about a kid in his class who'd thrown up in the cubbies. Doug laughed in the easy way he hadn't laughed in months. After dinner, while Doug was reading to the kids in the living room, Hannah and I were standing in my kitchen doing dishes. The radio was on low, I don't even remember what station, and a Patsy Cline song came on, Not Walkin' After Midnight. A different one, Crazy. Hannah went very still next to me at the sink. She didn't say anything. After a moment she reached over and put her hand on top of mine on the edge of the counter. She squeezed it once. Then she squeezed it again. Then she let go and picked up the next dish. We didn't say anything about it. We didn't have to. I want to say something to you, whoever you are, listening to this. If you have someone, a child, a parent, a brother, a sister, anyone you love, and there isn't a quiet way for them to tell you that something is wrong, please make one. It doesn't have to be a song. It can be a word. It can be a question about the weather. It can be the way they ask if you want ice in your water. It doesn't have to be clever, and it doesn't have to be elaborate. It just has to be between the two of you, and it has to be the kind of thing that the person hurting them would never think to listen for. The people who do what Trevor Halsworth did are very good at watching for the obvious signals. They watch for fear. They watch for someone calling the police. They watch for a husband who looks suspicious or a father who starts asking questions. They are not watching for an old country song on a Bluetooth speaker at a family dinner. They are not watching for a sentence about Tuesday rain. My daughter is alive and safe, and so are my grandchildren. A man who has done this to other families is not going to do it to any more of them. And the reason for both of those things is that a 17-year-old girl and her father, in the year after her mother died, made up a quiet way to ask for help. Because we knew the world wasn't always going to be the kind of place where a person could just ask out loud. I almost missed it. I want you to hear that. I almost missed it because I was carving a roast and listening to my son-in-law tell a story about traffic. Make a signal with the people you love. Make one tonight. Keep it small. Keep it boring. Keep it yours. It might be the only thing standing between somebody you love and somebody who has been waiting a very long time for them to be alone in a room with him. I know that because it was the only thing standing between my Hannah and a man whose name was never even Trevor. Make the signal. Mean it. And answer when it comes. I've thought about that Sunday dinner more times than I can count, and the part that still gets me is not the song or the prospectus or the photograph of Madeline in our front yard. The part that gets me is how close I came to missing all of it. I was tired. I was carving a roast. I was listening to Doug talk about a guy at his office. If Hannah hadn't reached back 23 years for something only the two of us knew, I would have driven home that night and slept fine, and a man whose name was never Trevor would have sat across from me at my own kitchen table within a month. I keep coming back to the chain of it. My wife Margaret got sick. My daughter at 16 was scared in ways she didn't know how to say out loud. The two of us made a quiet thing so she'd never have to. That quiet thing sat unused for over 2 decades, the way a fire extinguisher sits in the back of a closet, and when the fire came, it was the only tool in the house that fit. Nothing in this world is wasted if you build it out of love and you keep it honest. That is the only law I have come to fully trust at 64 years old. What you put in carefully, you get back when you need it. Not always how you expect, almost never when you expect, but it comes back. I want to say something to whoever is listening, because I think there are 3 things this whole mess taught me, and I don't want to lose them. The first is about character. Hannah did not panic. She did not lash out at Doug. She did not pretend nothing was happening. She carried something terrible for weeks because she was trying to protect her family, and when she finally asked for help, she asked the right way, of the right person, at the right moment. That is what character looks like in a real life. It isn't loud. It isn't on a poster. It's a woman slicing cucumber at her own counter, finding the courage to reach for a song. The second is about thinking clearly. I almost talked myself out of what I'd heard. I almost called her the next morning and asked if everything was fine and accepted yes for an answer and gone back to my crossword. The mind will always offer you the easier story. The work is to notice when the easier story is the lie you want to believe. I had 30 years of training and I still almost took the lie. So if you are someone who doesn't have that training, please give yourself permission to trust the small wrong feeling. It is almost always right. The third is about not giving up. Hannah was tired. She'd been managing this alone for months. She could have stayed quiet. Plenty of people do, and I understand why. But she found one more move in herself, and she made it. And because she made it, her children get to grow up with their mother, and 3 other families in this state get to keep what they worked for. One stubborn act of courage from a tired person changes more than people realize. Build your signal. Keep your word. And when somebody you love finally uses theirs, answer it.